For more than 3 centuries, the Philippines lived under Spanish colonial rule, a rule that shaped its people, its faith, its economy, and its identity. But in the late 19th century, a new generation began to question the old order. Educated Filipinos, soldiers, farmers, and laborers started asking the same question: why must a foreign power decide their fate? This is the story of how that question turned into the Philippine Revolution. From the early days of colonial oppression to the rise of reform movements in Europe and Manila, from the founding of secret societies to the battles that reshaped the nation, this documentary will trace the entire Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1898, the first national uprising in Asia against a Western empire. You will learn how the Spanish rule unraveled under internal pressure, how Filipinos organized one of the most complex revolutions of the century, and how their struggle for freedom intersected with global events like the Spanish-American War. Each event, each name, and each date in this story reveals how an oppressed colony transformed into a nation that demanded its own future. Now, to understand how it all began, we go back to the years before 1896, when colonial control was absolute, and the idea of Filipino independence was only beginning to take shape. The Philippines had been under Spanish rule for over 3 centuries by the late 19th century. Spanish colonial administration was highly centralized, with the governor-general appointed by the Spanish crown holding executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The archipelago was divided into provinces called alcaldias, each overseen by a Spanish governor or military officer. Beneath them were local officials, including the gobernadorcillos and cabezas de barangay, often drawn from the indigenous elite known as the Principalia. While the Principalia enjoyed certain privileges, the vast majority of Filipinos, referred to as Indios by the Spanish, lived under strict social and economic restrictions. Economic policies under Spanish rule were exploitative and aimed at extracting maximum revenue from the colony. Filipinos were subjected to the tributo, a poll tax imposed on all male residents, and the polo y servicios, a forced labor system requiring adult males to render service for public works or military construction for several months annually. These policies disrupted local economies, particularly in rural areas, and created widespread resentment. Additionally, Spanish monopolies over trade limited Filipino merchants and farmers, while friar-controlled lands dominated agricultural production in many provinces. The friars, who were members of religious orders such as the Augustinians, Dominicans, and Recollects, not only managed vast estates, but also controlled local governance and the collection of rents, which further compounded the oppression of ordinary Filipinos. Social and religious control was a central tool of Spanish authority. Catholicism was promoted not only as a faith, but as a mechanism of governance. Parish priests had enormous influence over local communities, regulating everything from marriage and education to taxation enforcement. Resistance to the Spanish was often suppressed as heresy or sedition. In addition, racial hierarchies placed Spaniards and mestizos above native Filipinos, which created systemic inequalities and reinforced social divisions. By the second half of the 19th century, a growing class of educated Filipinos, known as the Ilustrados, began advocating for reform. Many of these individuals had studied in Europe, particularly Spain, and were influenced by Enlightenment ideas, liberalism, and concepts of equality and human rights. Prominent figures such as José Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Graciano Lopez Gina formed the intellectual backbone of the reform movement, seeking recognition of Filipino rights and reforms in education, governance, and legal systems. Their writings exposed the abuses of the colonial administration and the friars, advocating for peaceful reform rather than immediate revolution. José Rizal, in particular, became the most influential figure of the period. His novels, Nali Mi Tanhair, 1887, and El Filibusterismo, 1891, depicted the social injustices, corruption, and abuses perpetrated by Spanish authorities and friars. Nali Mi Tanhair highlighted the plight of the oppressed and the moral decay within the colonial system, while El Filibusterismo portrayed the growing resentment and the possibility of rebellion if reforms were not granted. These works were widely read by educated Filipinos and disseminated secretly among those seeking change, effectively laying the ideological foundation for revolutionary movements. At the same time, the execution of 3 Filipino priests, Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, in 1872 following the Cavite Mutiny, created a powerful symbol of Spanish repression. The Gamborza, as they became known, inspired nationalist sentiment and emphasized the risks of challenging Spanish authority. Their deaths were cited repeatedly in reformist literature and became a rallying point for later revolutionary leaders. By the early 1890s, discontent had reached a critical mass. Widespread oppression, coupled with exposure to liberal and nationalist ideas, created an environment ripe for organized resistance. While some reformists advocated for incremental change, others concluded that complete independence was the only solution. The Katipunan, formed in 1892, emerged from this context, combining nationalist ideology with a secret revolutionary organization capable of mobilizing the masses. By the late 19th century, the social and economic structures of Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines had created widespread hardship among the majority of the population. The Filipino masses, primarily composed of rural farmers and laborers, were subjected to systems of taxation, forced labor, and land exploitation that systematically disadvantaged them while consolidating wealth and power among the colonial authorities and a small elite. One of the primary mechanisms of economic extraction was the tributo, or poll tax. This tax required all male subjects above a certain age to pay a fixed annual amount to the colonial administration. Failure to pay the tribute often resulted in imprisonment or forced labor. In addition to this, the Polo y Servicio system compelled all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 to provide labor for public works, military fortifications, and infrastructure projects, usually for a period of several months per year. These labor obligations were enforced strictly, often with physical punishment for those who attempted to evade service. The burden fell disproportionately on the rural population, who relied on farming for subsistence and could not easily replace the time lost to labor service. Land tenure under Spanish rule was another critical source of economic grievance. Large tracts of land were controlled by Spanish friars, religious orders, and wealthy Spanish or mestizo landlords. The friar estates, particularly prominent in regions like Laguna, Cavite, and Bulacan, were managed by parish priests who collected rent and other dues from tenant farmers. These rents were often excessive and subject to arbitrary increases, leaving Filipino tenants with minimal income and little security. The practice of paykyao, or forced labor in service imposed by landlords and priests, further reduced the farmers' capacity to sustain themselves. The combination of land monopolization and labor obligations limited agricultural productivity and reinforced social inequality, creating a pervasive sense of economic injustice. The Spanish administration also monopolized trade through restrictive policies. Only Spanish merchants were legally permitted to engage in significant commercial activities, particularly in the export of cash crops such as tobacco, sugar, and abaca. Filipino farmers and local traders were forced to sell their produce at prices determined by colonial intermediaries, often well below market value. These trade restrictions prevented local economic development and kept the majority of Filipinos dependent on subsistence agriculture. Coastal communities, where fishing and small-scale maritime trade were vital, experienced similar restrictions as Spanish authorities imposed tariffs and licensing requirements that limited local profits. Taxation and labor burdens were compounded by the obligation to provide military support during conflicts, including campaigns in Mindanao and elsewhere. Communities were expected to supply men, resources, and logistical support for Spanish military expeditions, further straining already limited local resources. The combination of forced labor, taxes, and tribute created cycles of poverty that affected nearly all provinces outside the colonial elite's control. Socially, these economic grievances intersected with the hierarchical structure imposed by the colonial system. Indigenous elites, the Principalia, were often complicit in enforcing colonial policies, which created tension between social classes. While the Principalia could access education, positions in local government, and certain exemptions from labor and taxes, the bulk of the population remained under strict control, with little opportunity for upward mobility. The widespread perception that wealth, land, and opportunity were monopolized by Spaniards, friars, and a small elite intensified popular dissatisfaction. The cumulative effect of these socioeconomic pressures was a growing desire among Filipinos for change. Rural and urban populations alike were affected by exploitation, and communities often supported one another in resisting excessive demands through petitions, minor local uprisings, and informal resistance. The abuses of the colonial system were not abstract grievances. They affected daily life, from access to food and shelter to the ability to work one's land and provide for a family. Historical records from provincial reports and eyewitness accounts indicate that dissatisfaction was widespread and not limited to particular social groups. By the mid-1890s, the social and economic conditions in the Philippines had created an environment in which organized resistance became feasible. Discontent was not only rooted in political ideas, but in tangible material grievances: the inability to control one's land, to trade freely, and to sustain family life without exploitation. These structural economic injustices provided the foundation upon which revolutionary movements, particularly the Katipunan, were able to mobilize support among the general population. The combination of taxation, forced labor, land dispossession, and trade restrictions ensured that the call for independence resonated with a broad cross-section of Filipino society. The ideological foundation of the Philippine Revolution was laid decades before 1896 through a combination of local grievances, intellectual developments, and historical incidents that exposed the oppressive nature of Spanish colonial rule. One of the earliest catalysts for nationalist consciousness was the execution of 3 Filipino priests, Mariano Gomez, José Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora. on February 17, 1872, commonly referred to as the Gamborza. These priests were accused by the Spanish authorities of inciting a mutiny at the Cavite arsenal, despite a lack of concrete evidence linking them to the event. Their trial and subsequent execution by garrote drew widespread condemnation among educated Filipinos and became a symbol of the systemic injustices perpetuated by colonial officials. The Gamborza case highlighted both the lack of legal protection for Filipinos under colonial law and the Spanish authorities' readiness to suppress perceived threats to their control, demonstrating the limits of reform within the colonial system. The period following the Gamborza executions saw the emergence of the propaganda movement, primarily composed of Filipino intellectuals who were educated in Spain and other European countries. Members of this movement included José Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, Graciano López Gina, and Mariano Ponce. Their central objective was to promote peaceful reform and representation of the Philippines within the Spanish Cortes. The movement was concentrated in publications such as La Solidaridad, which circulated essays, editorials, and commentary on colonial administration, abuses by the friars, and the need for equal rights for Filipinos. The propaganda movement articulated key principles such as secularization of the clergy, representation in government, freedom of speech, and reforms in education. These principles provided an intellectual framework that influenced both reformists and eventual revolutionaries. José Rizal's writings played a particularly significant role in shaping Filipino nationalist thought. His novel Nali Mi Tanhair, published in 1887, depicted the social injustices faced by ordinary Filipinos under Spanish rule. It exposed the corruption of local officials, the abuses of the friars, and the widespread social inequality experienced by the population. El Filibusterismo, published in 1891, presented a more critical view of the colonial system and explored the consequences of systemic oppression, emphasizing the urgency of reform and, for some readers, the potential necessity of revolutionary action. While Rizal himself advocated for reform rather than immediate armed revolt, his writings reached a wide audience and provided the ideological basis for the formation of secret revolutionary organizations. Rizal's arguments demonstrated that Spanish colonial policies were incompatible with principles of justice, civic participation, and human dignity, reinforcing the notion that structural change was necessary. Alongside the intellectual movement in Europe, practical events within the Philippines contributed to the development of revolutionary ideology. Local uprisings in the 19th century, such as the Palares Revolt in Pangasinan, 1762 to 1765, the Daguhoy Rebellion in Bohol, 1744 to 1829, and the Silang Revolt in Ilocos, 1762 to 1763, provided historical examples of Filipino resistance against Spanish authority. These uprisings, though largely unsuccessful, demonstrated that armed resistance was a historically recurring response to colonial abuses, particularly when reform efforts failed or were ignored. The memory of these revolts informed revolutionary leaders of the need for organization, popular support, and military planning. The ideological seeds of the revolution also emerged from growing communication and interaction between provincial leaders and reformists. Filipino elites and local leaders who were aware of abuses in their provinces began to recognize the limitations of petitions, appeals, and negotiations with colonial authorities. They concluded that systemic change required organized collective action rather than isolated or symbolic protests. The interaction between the Ilustrados in Europe and provincial leaders in the Philippines created a network of ideas, where education, reformist literature, and historical awareness converged to form a coherent intellectual foundation for revolutionary activity. Additionally, the proliferation of secret societies within the Philippines before 1892 provided practical structures for revolutionary activity. Some organizations, inspired by Freemasonry and other European secret societies, emphasized loyalty, secrecy, and collective action. These societies provided a model for organizing resistance while minimizing the risk of detection by colonial authorities. They combined ideological education with practical preparation, allowing members to discuss the principles of independence, equality, and national sovereignty in a controlled environment. The Katipunan, later established by Andrés Bonifacio, would build directly on this foundation, integrating ideological instruction with concrete revolutionary objectives. By the early 1890s, the combination of historical precedents, reformist ideology, and secret organizational practices created an environment in which the population was receptive to the idea of revolution. Filipinos were aware of the systemic injustices, the limits of reform, and the potential need for coordinated action. This ideological groundwork provided the basis for the emergence of the Katipunan in 1892, ensuring that when the revolution began in 1896, it would not be a spontaneous or isolated uprising, but a movement informed by decades of intellectual and historical preparation. The formation of the Katipunan in 1892 marked the first organized revolutionary movement in the Philippines aimed at achieving complete independence from Spanish colonial rule. The organization emerged in the context of decades of social, political, and economic grievances, combined with the intellectual influence of the propaganda movement. Its creation represented a shift from the reformist efforts advocated by the Ilustrados in Europe to a direct, grassroots approach to liberation. Andrés Bonifacio, a resident of Tonda, Manila, is widely recognized as the founder of the Katipunan, officially known as the Katastasang, Kagalingalangang Katipunan ng Mga Anaking Bayan, Supreme and Venerable Society of the Children of the Nation. Born in 1863 to a lower-class family, Bonifacio had limited formal education but gained exposure to political ideas through readings and involvement in local associations. Influenced by the writings of José Rizal and aware of the systemic oppression faced by Filipinos, Bonifacio sought to establish a secret society capable of mobilizing ordinary Filipinos in a coordinated struggle against Spanish authorities. The Katipunan was established as a clandestine organization to avoid detection by Spanish officials who had actively suppressed reformist and nationalist activities. Its structure emphasized secrecy, loyalty, and discipline. The organization adopted a hierarchical system with a Supreme Council, provincial councils, and local cells, ensuring both operational security and effective communication across Manila and the surrounding provinces. Membership initiation involved oaths of allegiance and rituals designed to reinforce unity and commitment. Members pledged loyalty to the Katipunan and a commitment to the cause of independence, agreeing to maintain secrecy under penalty of death. The use of pseudonyms and coded correspondence further protected the identities of members and their families from colonial authorities. Ideologically, the Katipunan centered on the principles of independence, equality, and national sovereignty. The organization advocated for the overthrow of Spanish rule through armed resistance, viewing reform efforts as insufficient and largely ineffective. Unlike the propaganda movement, which relied on petitions, publications, and appeals to the Spanish government, the Katipunan emphasized practical preparation for revolution, including military training, recruitment, and logistical planning. Membership in the Katipunan grew rapidly. By 1896, estimates suggest that the organization had reached approximately 100,000 members, spanning Manila and multiple provinces, including Cavite, Bulacan, Pampanga, and Batangas. Recruitment strategies focused on both educated Filipinos and the working class, particularly laborers, artisans, and small-scale farmers, who were most affected by colonial oppression. The organization's appeal was strengthened by its ability to provide both a political and social network, allowing members to share ideas, organize local initiatives, and coordinate resistance. The Katipunan also developed a system of communication and propaganda to educate members about the objectives and methods of the organization. Written materials, including circulars, leaflets, and manuals, explain the principles of the movement, the structure of the organization, and strategies for evading detection. Leaders emphasized both discipline and unity, ensuring that the society remained cohesive despite the challenges of operating in secrecy under a colonial regime. In addition, the Katipunan established symbols such as flags, emblems, and rituals to reinforce identity and solidarity among members. Internal governance within the Katipunan included the appointment of officials at multiple levels. The Supreme Council, or Supremo, directed overall strategy, while local councils handled recruitment, intelligence gathering, and the coordination of revolutionary activities within provinces. Andrés Bonifacio served as the Supremo, responsible for planning operations, maintaining security, and providing ideological guidance to members. Other key figures, including Deodato Arellano, Teodoro Plata, and Valentin Diaz, played critical roles in administration, recruitment, and outreach. The establishment of the Katipunan also reflected lessons drawn from previous uprisings and the broader history of secret societies. The use of clandestine cells and hierarchical structures allowed the organization to survive despite colonial surveillance and repression. Members were instructed in basic military training and the use of weapons, while also being encouraged to maintain a network of supporters within local communities to provide intelligence and logistical support. The combination of ideological preparation, organizational discipline, and practical military readiness positioned the Katipunan as the central mechanism for mobilizing widespread revolutionary action in the Philippines. By 1896, the Katipunan had become a cohesive and expansive organization capable of initiating a coordinated rebellion. Its membership, structure, and ideological foundation allowed for the rapid dissemination of revolutionary ideas and the planning of armed action. The formation of the Katipunan represented a decisive shift from reformist advocacy toward confrontation with Spanish authorities, establishing a clear framework for the uprising that would officially begin later that year. By 1896, the Katipunan had grown into a significant underground organization with widespread membership across Manila and neighboring provinces. Its secret activities, however, were vulnerable to exposure, and Spanish authorities had long suspected the existence of a revolutionary network. On August 19, 1896, the Spanish colonial government received intelligence that confirmed the existence of the Katipunan. This information came primarily from a member who had been discovered and subsequently revealed details under pressure. The Spanish authorities acted swiftly, arresting key figures in Manila and conducting searches of homes, printing presses, and known meeting places. These actions signaled the imminent threat to the revolutionary network and forced the Katipunan leadership to make critical decisions about the timing of armed revolt. The discovery of the Katipunan placed Andrés Bonifacio and his fellow leaders in a position where preemptive action was necessary. Rather than risk further arrests and dismantling of the organization, Bonifacio convened emergency meetings with his closest associates to plan the initiation of a coordinated uprising. Recognizing that secrecy was no longer viable, the leadership determined that open rebellion would begin immediately. In response, Bonifacio issued instructions for members to prepare for armed resistance and to gather in designated areas in Manila and the surrounding provinces. On August 23, 1896, the revolution officially began with an event commonly referred to as the Cry of Balintawak. While there is some variation in historical accounts regarding the exact location, the essential event involved Katipunan members tearing their cédulas, the residence certificates issued by Spanish authorities, in a symbolic act of defiance against colonial rule. This act represented the formal rejection of Spanish authority and the assertion of Filipino self-determination. The tearing of the cédulas was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated to members and the local population that the revolution had begun and that participation carried both commitment and risk. Following the Cry of Balintawak, the revolution rapidly spread to multiple areas in Manila and nearby provinces. Early uprisings occurred in neighborhoods such as Tonda and San Juan del Monte, where Katipunan members engaged in armed confrontations with Spanish forces. The revolutionary strategy at this stage emphasized surprise attacks and the occupation of strategic locations, including local government offices, police stations, and military garrisons. The intention was to disrupt colonial control and to demonstrate the capacity of the Katipunan to mobilize and coordinate armed resistance. The first major engagement in the early stages of the revolution was the Battle of San Juan del Monte, which occurred on August 30th, 1896. In this encounter, approximately 800 Katipunan members, many armed with bladed weapons and improvised firearms, confronted Spanish troops who were better trained, better armed, and numerically superior. The revolutionaries faced significant challenges, including limited military experience, inadequate weaponry, and the absence of coordinated artillery support. Despite these disadvantages, the engagement demonstrated the organizational capability and determination of the Katipunan to confront colonial authority directly. The Spanish forces repelled the attack, inflicting substantial casualties on the revolutionaries, but the uprising continued to gain attention and support in surrounding communities. In addition to military confrontations, the early outbreak of the revolution included efforts to establish local revolutionary committees in various provinces. These committees were tasked with recruiting members, securing supplies, gathering intelligence on Spanish movements, and organizing local militias. Provinces such as Cavite, Bulacan, and Laguna responded to the uprising by mobilizing local populations, with some towns experiencing full-scale revolts against Spanish authorities. The rapid spread of the revolution was facilitated by pre-existing Katipunan networks, which had maintained secrecy and local organizational structures over the previous 4 years. The discovery of the Katipunan and the immediate outbreak of the revolution highlighted the limitations of Spanish colonial administration in controlling widespread dissent. While the authorities had extensive intelligence networks and the capacity for rapid military deployment, the revolutionary network's decentralized organization allowed uprisings to occur in multiple locations simultaneously. The early phase of the revolution demonstrated both the potential of organized popular resistance and the challenges posed by confronting a professional colonial military. The events of late August 1896 established the framework for the subsequent phases of the Philippine Revolution. The Cry of Balintawak and the Battle of San Juan del Monte represented the transition from clandestine preparation to overt armed resistance. These events also underscored the critical role of leadership, organization, and local support in sustaining a revolutionary movement under conditions of limited resources and high risk. By initiating open rebellion, the Katipunan set in motion a chain of events that would escalate into a nationwide struggle against Spanish colonial rule, marking the formal beginning of the Philippine Revolution. Following the Cry of Balintawak on August 23, 1896, the Philippine Revolution spread rapidly across Manila and nearby provinces, signaling the transition from clandestine preparation to widespread armed resistance. The initial uprisings involved both strategic attacks on Spanish positions and spontaneous revolts in towns where Katipunan influence had already taken root. The early phase of the revolution demonstrated both the organizational capacity of the Katipunan and the widespread discontent among the Filipino population. In Manila, the first organized engagements occurred in districts such as Tonda, San Juan del Monte, and Sampaloc. Revolutionary forces, primarily composed of Katipunan members, attempted to seize control of local police stations, military outposts, and Spanish garrisons. These engagements were characterized by improvised strategies, as the revolutionaries had limited military training and primarily relied on bladed weapons, homemade firearms, and limited artillery captured or improvised from local materials. Despite these constraints, the revolutionaries demonstrated cohesion in executing coordinated attacks and mobilizing local populations to participate or provide logistical support. The Battle of San Juan del Monte on August 30th, 1896, represented the first significant confrontation between organized Katipunan forces and Spanish troops. Approximately 800 revolutionaries, led by Andrés Bonifacio and other local leaders, advanced towards Spanish-held facilities, aiming to disrupt colonial control and seize weapons. Spanish forces, including well-trained infantry, artillery units, and loyalist auxiliaries, repelled the attack. Revolutionary casualties were substantial, with historical estimates indicating dozens of deaths and hundreds wounded, while the Spanish forces sustained fewer losses due to superior equipment and discipline. Despite the setback, the battle served to galvanize support for the revolution by demonstrating the willingness of ordinary Filipinos to challenge Spanish authority directly. Beyond Manila, uprisings quickly spread to surrounding provinces where the Katipunan influence had been established. In Cavite, multiple towns, including Imus, Bacoor, and Kawit, witnessed coordinated attacks against Spanish garrisons and local officials. Revolutionary commanders such as Emilio Aguinaldo, Mariano Alvarez, and Baldomero Aguinaldo organized local militias to defend strategic positions and conduct offensive operations. Cavite became a critical stronghold for the revolution due to its proximity to Manila, dense population, and the high level of local support for the Katipunan. The province's successful early engagements, including the capture of towns and local forts, established a model for revolutionary strategy and coordination. In Batangas, revolutionary activity was initially more limited but involved strategic raids and the mobilization of local populations against Spanish authorities. Leaders such as Miguel Malvar organized smaller units to harass colonial forces, secure supplies, and recruit new members. These early uprisings emphasized guerrilla tactics, leveraging knowledge of local terrain, rivers, and forests to offset the technological and numerical superiority of Spanish troops. Similarly, provinces such as Bulacan, Pampanga, and Laguna experienced localized revolts, with towns raising revolutionary flags and mobilizing residents to participate in attacks or provide intelligence. Communication between revolutionary units relied on couriers, local networks, and prearranged signals, enabling coordination despite the dispersed nature of the uprisings. The Katipunan's hierarchical structure allowed regional leaders to operate semi-autonomously while maintaining adherence to the overall strategic objectives set by Bonifacio and the Supreme Council. This decentralized approach increased resilience, as the disruption of one cell did not collapse revolutionary activity in other areas. Early uprisings also demonstrated the challenges faced by the revolutionaries. Lack of uniform training, limited access to firearms, and insufficient supplies hindered sustained engagements. Spanish authorities responded with military reinforcements, punitive expeditions, and mass arrests, targeting both active combatants and suspected sympathizers. Reports indicate that Spanish forces executed suspected Katipunan members, burned villages, and imposed stricter surveillance, increasing the risk for revolutionaries operating in contested areas. Despite these measures, the uprisings persisted, reflecting the widespread dissatisfaction with colonial rule and the organizational capacity of the Katipunan to maintain operations under pressure. By the end of the initial phase, the revolution had evolved from a series of isolated incidents into a coordinated regional movement. The combination of urban engagements in Manila, provincial uprisings in Cavite, Batangas, and Bulacan, and the establishment of local militias and revolutionary committees demonstrated the capacity for sustained resistance. These early successes, even when accompanied by defeats, created momentum for further military campaigns and set the stage for subsequent strategic developments, including leadership consolidation and the expansion of revolutionary governance. The initial phase of the Philippine Revolution in 1896 highlighted both the potential and the vulnerabilities of the revolutionary movement. While the uprisings in Manila, Cavite, and surrounding provinces demonstrated widespread support for independence, the revolutionaries faced significant challenges in confronting the well-equipped and organized Spanish colonial forces. These early setbacks forced the Katipunan and provincial revolutionary leaders to adapt their strategies, organization, and methods of warfare to sustain the struggle. Following engagements such as the Battle of San Juan del Monte on August 30th, 1896, Spanish troops launched aggressive counterinsurgency campaigns to suppress the uprisings. They deployed reinforcements from Manila and provincial garrisons, utilizing artillery, cavalry, and infantry units against poorly armed Katipunan forces. The revolutionaries, many of whom possessed only knives, spears, and rudimentary firearms, suffered heavy casualties in confrontations. Reports from the period indicate that dozens of revolutionaries were killed, hundreds were wounded, and many more were captured or executed. These losses undermined the morale of some units and exposed the organizational and logistical weaknesses of the revolutionary movement in urban and provincial settings. Leadership within the Katipunan faced scrutiny during this period. Andrés Bonifacio, serving as Supremo, was responsible for coordinating the revolutionary campaign, yet the decentralization of operations and the limited military training of members complicated command and control. Some provincial leaders questioned Bonifacio's decisions, including the timing and targets of initial attacks. Internal debates arose regarding whether to continue direct assaults on Spanish garrisons or to adopt more defensive and tactical approaches, particularly in regions where Spanish military presence was strongest. These debates underscored the tension between revolutionary zeal and practical military considerations. In response to early setbacks, the revolutionaries adapted their strategies by shifting from conventional assaults to guerrilla warfare. This approach leveraged the revolutionaries' knowledge of local geography, including forests, rivers, and mountainous terrain, to conduct ambushes, raids, and hit-and-run attacks against Spanish forces. In Cavite, for example, Emilio Aguinaldo and local commanders organized small, mobile units capable of striking Spanish detachments and retreating before reinforcements arrived. These tactics reduced casualties relative to frontal assaults and allowed the revolutionaries to maintain pressure on Spanish authorities despite inferior weaponry. The revolutionaries also relied on the support of local communities to sustain their operations. Villagers provided food, shelter, intelligence, and guides, which enabled the revolutionaries to move effectively across contested areas. Local knowledge proved critical in planning ambushes, avoiding Spanish patrols, and identifying safe locations for temporary encampments. This network of support became a central component of revolutionary strategy, allowing the movement to survive in areas where direct military engagement would have been unsustainable. Another adaptation involved efforts to increase the supply of weapons and ammunition. While the Katipunan initially relied on locally produced firearms, knives, and other improvised weapons, leaders sought to capture Spanish arms during raids or to acquire firearms through clandestine networks. These efforts were limited by resources and logistical constraints, but reflected the growing sophistication of revolutionary planning and the recognition that sustained military operations required reliable armaments. Organizationally, the revolutionaries established local councils to manage recruitment, communications, and logistics in the provinces. These councils operated semi-autonomously under the overall guidance of the Supreme Council in Manila, allowing regional leaders to make tactical decisions while adhering to strategic objectives. This decentralized approach increased resilience, as setbacks in one area did not collapse revolutionary activity elsewhere. It also facilitated the rapid dissemination of orders, coordination of simultaneous uprisings, and the mobilization of reinforcements where necessary. Despite these adaptations, the revolutionaries continued to face significant challenges. Spanish counterinsurgency operations included the execution of suspected Katipunan members, the burning of villages suspected of harboring rebels, and the deployment of loyalist militias. These measures aimed to isolate the revolutionaries from local support and to disrupt organizational networks. The threat of arrest or execution imposed constant pressure on both leaders and rank-and-file members, emphasizing the high-risk environment in which the revolution operated. The early setbacks and subsequent adaptations established key principles that would guide the remainder of the Philippine Revolution. Leaders recognized the necessity of flexible tactics, local intelligence, logistical support, and decentralized command structures. These lessons informed subsequent military campaigns, provincial uprisings, and organizational reforms that increased the movement's resilience and effectiveness. By learning from the initial losses and adjusting strategies accordingly, the revolutionaries created the foundation for sustained resistance that would continue throughout 1897 and beyond. Why early 1897? The Philippine Revolution had evolved from initial uprisings into a complex, multi-provincial struggle. While the Katipunan had successfully mobilized large numbers of Filipinos and initiated armed resistance against Spanish forces, internal divisions among revolutionary leaders began to emerge. Disagreements over strategy, authority, and organizational structure created tension within the movement, culminating in conflicts that significantly influenced the trajectory of the revolution. The Katipunan's founder, Andrés Bonifacio, held the title of Supremo, serving as the organization's overall leader and primary strategist. Bonifacio had guided the initial uprisings and coordinated efforts in Manila and nearby provinces. However, as the revolution expanded into Cavite, Batangas, and other regions, local leaders with growing influence challenged Bonifacio's authority. In Cavite, Emilio Aguinaldo and Mariano Alvarez led revolutionary forces that achieved notable successes, including the capture of towns and Spanish outposts. Their effectiveness in the field, combined with the loyalty of local troops, positioned them as prominent figures in the revolutionary hierarchy. Tensions between Bonifacio and provincial leaders were exacerbated by differences in strategic approach. Bonifacio had emphasized rapid, coordinated action across multiple areas, whereas leaders in Cavite preferred more systematic military campaigns, often employing siege tactics and defensive positioning. These tactical disagreements were compounded by questions of legitimacy and governance, as some leaders argued that Bonifacio's authority should be secondary to commanders demonstrating battlefield effectiveness. The expansion of the revolutionary movement made it increasingly difficult for a single leader in Manila to exercise direct control over distant provincial forces. In an attempt to resolve these disputes and establish a formal government for the revolutionary movement, the Tegueros Convention was convened on March 22, 1897, in the town of Tegueros, Cavite. The convention gathered representatives from various revolutionary factions, including the Magdiwang and Magdalo councils, which were local councils within Cavite that had aligned with different leaders. The stated purpose of the convention was to elect officers for a new revolutionary government, thereby consolidating authority and providing a structured chain of command to direct military and political operations. During the Tegueros Convention, elections were held to determine the leadership of the revolutionary government. Emilio Aguinaldo was elected president, while Mariano Trias became vice president and Artemio Recruit was appointed as general. Andrés Bonifacio ran for the position of Director of the Interior but faced challenges from other candidates, including Daniel Tirona, who publicly questioned Bonifacio's qualifications in education, citing his lack of formal schooling. The public questioning of Bonifacio's competence undermined his authority and contributed to internal divisions. Bonifacio initially accepted the results but later nullified the proceedings, citing irregularities and procedural issues, reflecting his dissatisfaction with the outcome and the perceived marginalization of his leadership role. The leadership conflict intensified after the convention. Bonifacio attempted to assert his authority independently by establishing an alternative government and maintaining control over loyal forces. However, Aguinaldo and the newly established Revolutionary Council, supported by effective provincial commanders, moved to consolidate power. Bonifacio's position weakened as Aguinaldo's forces gained recognition from a broader coalition of revolutionary leaders and received increased local support in Cavite and adjacent provinces. On May 10, 1897, Bonifacio and his supporters were arrested in Cavite on charges of sedition and treason against the revolutionary government. Following a trial conducted by Aguinaldo's government, Bonifacio and his wife, Gregoria de Jesus, were initially sentenced to death. Despite some debate among revolutionary leaders regarding clemency, the execution was carried out on May 10, 1897, in the mountains of Maragondon, Cavite. Bonifacio's death marked a turning point in the leadership structure of the revolution, effectively transferring authority to Aguinaldo and his allies and consolidating power under a more centralized revolutionary government. The leadership conflicts of 1897 demonstrate the complexities of revolutionary movements in which ideological unity coexists with personal ambitions, regional loyalties, and differences in strategic approaches. While the Katipunan had initially operated as a cohesive secret society, the expansion of the revolution necessitated formal governance structures and military hierarchies, which in turn created friction among leaders. The resolution of these conflicts, through the establishment of a new revolutionary government under Aguinaldo, allowed for more coordinated provincial campaigns, and contributed to the eventual consolidation of revolutionary authority in key regions such as Cavite. After the leadership transition in early 1897, the Philippine Revolution entered a more organized phase under Emilio Aguinaldo's command. The revolutionary movement, now unified under the framework established at the Tigueros Convention, focused on consolidating its territorial control and expanding its influence beyond Cavite. Aguinaldo, drawing upon his earlier military successes, sought to strengthen the Revolutionary Army's organization, implement tactical reforms, and maintain morale among troops after the internal turmoil caused by the execution of Andrés Bonifacio. The reorganization of revolutionary forces began with the establishment of a central command based in Cavite, where Aguinaldo had previously led successful engagements against Spanish forces. The Magdalo Council, aligned with Aguinaldo, prioritized the fortification of key towns such as Imus, Bacoor, and Dasmariñas, transforming them into defensive strongholds equipped with trenches, bamboo fortifications, and supply depots. The defensive structures reflected lessons learned from earlier defeats, emphasizing the need for coordinated defense rather than scattered offensives. The revolutionaries faced persistent Spanish counteroffensives during this period. Governor-General Camilo de Polavija, who had replaced Ramon Blanco in December 1896, implemented a large-scale military campaign aimed at crushing the rebellion in Cavite. Spanish troops, supported by artillery and reinforcements from Manila, launched assaults on rebel-held towns between January and March 1897. The battles of Silang, Naic, and Pérez das Marinas resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. Despite the revolutionaries' determination, superior Spanish firepower forced them to retreat into more defensible mountainous terrain. By March 1897, the revolutionary forces, under increasing pressure, withdrew toward the mountainous areas of Indang and Maragondon, eventually establishing a base in Biak-na-Bato, a remote region in Bulacan. The relocation marked a strategic shift from open engagements to guerrilla warfare, leveraging the natural terrain for defense and mobility. Aguinaldo directed his troops to establish supply routes, communication lines, and training centers to sustain prolonged resistance. The rugged geography of Biak-na-Bato provided a refuge for revolutionary leaders and allowed for the reorganization of forces following months of heavy conflict. Throughout this period, the revolutionaries conducted smaller provincial campaigns in Laguna, Batangas, and Bulacan, coordinated by leaders such as Miguel Malvar, José Rizal, and Gregorio del Pilar. These campaigns, though limited in scale compared to the major battles in Cavite, played a critical role in maintaining the revolutionary spirit and stretching Spanish forces thin across multiple fronts. Guerrilla tactics, including ambushes and surprise raids, disrupted Spanish logistics and communication networks, forcing colonial authorities to divert resources from major strongholds to address localized uprisings. The Spanish government's military expenditures and prolonged engagements began to strain its resources by mid-1897. Governor-General Fernando Primo de Rivera, who succeeded Polavija in April, adopted a combined military and diplomatic strategy. While continuing offensive operations, he initiated efforts to open communication channels with revolutionary leaders to explore the possibility of a negotiated truce. The Spanish authorities recognized that a purely military victory was unlikely to end the widespread resistance across Luzon. Despite earlier setbacks, Aguinaldo's leadership began to show results by late 1897. The reorganized Revolutionary Army demonstrated improved discipline and coordination. Key victories, such as the successful defense of positions in Talisui and Naic, strengthened morale and showcased the effectiveness of localized command structures. Aguinaldo also initiated administrative measures to regulate taxation, supply procurement, and recruitment within liberated zones, establishing a semblance of governance that extended beyond mere military control. These developments transformed the revolution from a series of scattered uprisings into a structured, multi-provincial campaign for independence. One of the most notable outcomes of this period was the increasing visibility of revolutionary leadership across the provinces. Leaders like Mariano Trias, Emilio Riego de Dios, Severino de las Alas, and Idilberto Evangelista played significant roles in coordinating military operations. Evangelista, a trained civil engineer, was instrumental in designing defensive fortifications and logistical routes. Though his death at the Battle of Zapote Bridge in February 1897 was a major loss for the revolutionary cause. The deaths of several key figures in battle further illustrated the challenges of sustaining organized resistance against a better-armed colonial army. As the campaigns continued, Aguinaldo established formal communication with emissaries representing Governor-General Primo de Rivera. These discussions eventually paved the way for negotiations that led to the Pact of Biak-na-Bato later that year. The consolidation of revolutionary control in several provinces, combined with the ability to maintain operations despite heavy Spanish offensives, positioned Aguinaldo to negotiate from a position of relative strength. The provisional revolutionary government that emerged during this period served as the foundation for subsequent political and military developments, reflecting the maturing structure of the independence movement. The provincial campaigns of 1897 were characterized by adaptive strategy, shifting from open confrontation to flexible resistance and political maneuvering. These campaigns solidified regional networks, integrated local leadership, and demonstrated the revolutionaries' capacity for sustained organization under adverse conditions. The experience gained during this phase directly contributed to the later successes of the movement during the renewed revolutionary struggle in 1898. After months of military campaigns and repeated relocations, Emilio Aguinaldo and his forces consolidated their position in Biak-na-Bato, located in the mountainous region of San Miguel, Bulacan. The move in mid-1897 marked the beginning of a new phase of the revolution, the establishment of an organized revolutionary government. This government aimed to unify military and civil authority under one administration, provide direction for the revolutionary struggle, and manage the growing network of liberated areas across central Luzon. At Biak-na-Bato, Aguinaldo and his council established what became known as the Republic of Biak-na-Bato, formally proclaimed in November 1897. The Republic functioned as a provisional revolutionary government, seeking to institutionalize leadership and governance structures that had previously been ad hoc. Aguinaldo, as president, oversaw both military and civil operations. The revolutionary cabinet included key figures such as Emilio Riego de Dios as Secretary of War, Antonio Montenegro as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and Isabelo Artacho as Secretary of the Interior. The establishment of these offices demonstrated the movement's shift from a loosely coordinated rebellion to a formalized revolutionary administration. To provide a legal and ideological foundation for the new government, Isabelo Artacho and Felix Ferrer drafted the Constitution of Biak-na-Bato, which was modeled partly after the constitutions of Cuba and Mexico. Signed on November 1, 1897, the Constitution outlined the framework for a republican government based on principles of equality, liberty, and popular sovereignty. It specified the separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and it declared the aim of securing Philippine independence from Spanish rule. The Constitution also recognized the rights of citizens and established a National Assembly to represent the revolutionary provinces, marking an early attempt at constitutional governance in Philippine history. The Biak-na-Bato government sought to address multiple priorities simultaneously: organizing defense, maintaining internal order, managing supplies, and sustaining communication among revolutionary units. Aguinaldo established regulations for the collection of taxes and contributions from liberated towns to fund the war effort. A system of receipts and accounting was introduced to prevent misuse of funds and to create administrative consistency. These measures allowed the government to finance the construction of fortifications, purchase arms, and support troops stationed in remote areas. Communication networks were maintained through a courier system that connected Biak-na-Bato with revolutionary zones in Cavite, Laguna, Batangas, and Pampanga. Secret routes and coded messages were used to evade Spanish patrols, ensuring that orders from the central government reached provincial commanders. Despite these efforts, logistical challenges persisted. Ammunition shortages, inconsistent supply deliveries, and the difficulty of coordinating distant forces under wartime conditions limited the effectiveness of centralized command. Beyond military affairs, the Biak-na-Bato government emphasized education and propaganda as tools of nation-building. Revolutionary publications were produced to inform Filipinos about the goals of the revolution and to counter Spanish narratives. Among these was the newspaper Kalayaan, originally linked to the Katipunan, whose ideals continued to influence revolutionary communications. Efforts were also made to maintain morale among troops and civilians by emphasizing the cause of national independence rather than local or factional interests. The establishment of the Biak-na-Bato Republic coincided with renewed Spanish attempts to suppress the revolution. Governor-General Fernando Primo de Rivera launched extensive military operations aimed at capturing Aguinaldo and dismantling the revolutionary base. However, the terrain of Biak-na-Bato provided natural protection. The revolutionaries constructed an elaborate network of caves, tunnels, and mountain shelters that served as both administrative headquarters and refuge. The area became a symbol of resistance, demonstrating the revolution's ability to adapt and endure under pressure. Despite the Republic's symbolic strength, sustaining it proved increasingly difficult. Internal disputes emerged over resource distribution and leadership authority. Some commanders questioned the handling of funds and the appointment of officials. Additionally, continuous Spanish offensives made it challenging to maintain stability. These pressures prompted both sides, the revolutionary leadership and the Spanish authorities, to consider negotiations. Governor-General Primo de Rivera recognized that continued military campaigns were costly and inconclusive, while Aguinaldo saw an opportunity to regroup and secure material support for future operations. In late November 1897, initial contacts between emissaries of both parties began. The Spanish side was represented by Pedro Paterno, a Filipino lawyer and intermediary who proposed a truce that would end hostilities. Aguinaldo, wary but pragmatic, agreed to consider the terms. Negotiations proceeded cautiously, with both sides seeking to achieve their objectives without conceding too much. These talks laid the groundwork for the Pact of Biak-na-Bato, which would be signed the following month. The Biak-na-Bato Republic represented a crucial stage in the evolution of Filipino revolutionary governance. It demonstrated the capacity of Filipino leaders to organize an administrative system under wartime conditions and articulate a vision of independence grounded in constitutional principles. Though short-lived, its establishment showed that the revolution had progressed from spontaneous rebellion to a movement capable of political institution building and statecraft. By late 1897, the Philippine Revolution had reached a stalemate. The Spanish colonial government under Governor-General Fernando Primo de Rivera continued its military offensives but failed to destroy the revolutionary base at Biak-na-Bato. The revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had established a functioning provisional government but lacked sufficient arms and resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. Both sides, recognizing the limitations of continued warfare, began exploring the possibility of negotiation to bring temporary stability to the archipelago. The intermediary in these negotiations was Pedro Alejandro Paterno, a Filipino lawyer, writer, and reform advocate who positioned himself as a mediator between the Spanish authorities and the revolutionary leadership. Paterno began corresponding with Governor-General Primo de Rivera in August 1897, offering to broker a peace agreement. The Governor-General, under increasing pressure from Madrid to resolve the rebellion, accepted the proposal. Paterno then traveled to Biak-na-Bato to meet Aguinaldo and the Revolutionary Council, initiating a series of discussions that would continue for several months. The peace talks took place under difficult conditions. Spanish military operations persisted in surrounding provinces, and communication between negotiators was often delayed due to the terrain and ongoing hostilities. Paterno presented a series of proposals from the Spanish authorities, which included general amnesty, financial compensation, and promises of reform in exchange for the cessation of armed resistance. Aguinaldo and his advisors analyzed each proposal carefully, debating whether Spain would honor its commitments. Skepticism was widespread among the revolutionary ranks, given the history of unfulfilled reform promises made by previous colonial administrations. After extensive deliberation, an agreement was finalized in December 1897. The Pact of Biak-na-Bato, signed on December 14 to 15, 1897, consisted of three main documents: a general amnesty for revolutionaries, financial indemnity for those who would go into voluntary exile, and a promise of reform from the Spanish government. Under the terms of the pact, Aguinaldo and other revolutionary leaders agreed to lay down their arms and go into exile in Hong Kong. In return, the Spanish authorities would pay the revolutionaries 800,000 Cuban pesos to be delivered in 3 installments, and implement political and administrative reforms aimed at improving governance and Filipino representation. The first payment of 400,000 Cuban pesos was to be delivered immediately upon Aguinaldo's departure, with the remaining amounts contingent on the surrender of additional arms and the maintenance of peace. The funds were intended to compensate the revolutionaries and to serve as a potential reserve for future operations if Spain failed to fulfill its promises. The amnesty clause guaranteed safe passage for those who participated in the uprising and pledged to end hostilities. It was also agreed that Spanish troops would halt offensive operations once the revolutionary leaders had evacuated Biak-na-Bato. On December 24, 1897, Aguinaldo and approximately 25 of his top officers and advisors, including Gregorio del Pilar, Severino de las Alas, and Emilio Riego de Dios, departed for Hong Kong. They traveled under Spanish escort, marking the end of the first phase of the Philippine Revolution. The journey was a tactical decision rather than an act of surrender. Aguinaldo viewed the truce as a temporary pause that would allow the revolutionaries to reorganize, secure resources, and prepare for future action if Spain failed to implement genuine reforms. Upon arrival in Hong Kong, the exiled leaders established what became known as the Hong Kong Junta, which functioned as a revolutionary committee in exile responsible for managing funds and coordinating communications with supporters in the Philippines. In the Philippines, the truce temporarily halted large-scale hostilities. Spanish authorities proclaimed the end of the rebellion and celebrated the agreement as a political success. Governor-General Primo de Rivera reported to Madrid that peace had been restored in the colony. However, while the Spanish administration maintained public optimism, many Filipino revolutionaries who remained in the islands doubted the sincerity of the government's promises. Reports of continued abuses by local officials and friars, along with the absence of tangible reforms, quickly eroded confidence in the pact's long-term viability. The financial aspects of the agreement also became a point of contention. Only the first installment of 400,000 Cuban pesos was paid in full, while subsequent payments were delayed or withheld due to disputes over compliance. Aguinaldo and his associates used part of the funds to purchase arms and ammunition from Hong Kong, indicating that they had not abandoned the revolutionary cause. The remaining funds were managed collectively, though disagreements occasionally arose regarding their allocation. The exiled revolutionaries maintained regular communication with contacts in the Philippines, monitoring developments and preparing contingency plans should the truce collapse. The Spanish government, despite its assurances, failed to implement the promised reforms. The structure of colonial administration and the dominance of the friar orders remained unchanged. The return of Governor-General Primo de Rivera to Spain in early 1898 and his replacement by Basilio Augustin further diminished the likelihood of meaningful change. As the year progressed, the international situation shifted dramatically with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in April 1898, altering the political context in which the revolution would resume. The Pact of Biak-na-Bato represented a temporary cessation of hostilities rather than a genuine resolution of the conflict. While it ended the first phase of the revolution and brought Aguinaldo and his associates into exile, it also preserved the core structure of the revolutionary movement, which remained prepared to resume the struggle when circumstances allowed. The agreement's failure to deliver on reform commitments would soon lead to renewed fighting, setting the stage for the revolution's resurgence in 1898. The temporary peace achieved through the Pact of Biak-na-Bato in December 1897 proved short-lived. While the truce ended open hostilities, it failed to resolve the underlying causes of the Philippine Revolution. The Spanish colonial administration did not fulfill its promises of political reform, land redistribution, or friar reduction. The revolutionary leaders exiled in Hong Kong, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, closely monitored these developments and prepared to resume the struggle if necessary. Their opportunity came in 1898, when international events altered the balance of power in the Pacific. In April 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out following the explosion of the U.S. battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor and the subsequent American declaration of war against Spain. The conflict quickly extended to the Philippines, which was a Spanish colony and an important strategic location. The United States sought to eliminate Spanish naval power in Asia and to secure the archipelago as part of its wider war objectives. On May 1, 1898, U.S. Commodore George Dewey led the Asiatic Squadron into Manila Bay, where he engaged, and destroyed the Spanish fleet under Admiral Patricio Montojo in the Battle of Manila Bay. The decisive victory effectively ended Spanish naval presence in the Philippines and opened the way for further American involvement in the archipelago's internal affairs. Following the American victory, U.S. officials recognized the potential value of Filipino cooperation in defeating the remaining Spanish land forces. Dewey, who was aware of Aguinaldo's influence over the revolutionary movement, initiated contact with him through intermediaries, including U.S. Consul E. Spencer Pratt in Singapore. In late April 1898, Pratt met with Aguinaldo and discussed the possibility of collaboration between American forces and Filipino revolutionaries. Although no formal treaty or written agreement was signed, Aguinaldo was given assurances that the United States had no intention of colonizing the Philippines and that Filipino independence would be respected after the defeat of Spain. Encouraged by these assurances, Aguinaldo accepted the offer of cooperation. On May 19, 1898, he returned to the Philippines from Hong Kong aboard the U.S. vessel McCulloch, accompanied by several revolutionary officers and advisors. Upon arrival at Cavite, Aguinaldo immediately began reorganizing the revolutionary movement. He issued proclamations calling for the resumption of the struggle for independence and urged former revolutionaries to take up arms once more. Many of his former comrades, including Mariano Trias, Baldomero Aguinaldo, and Gregorio del Pilar, rallied to his leadership. Within weeks, revolutionary activity intensified across Luzon and spread rapidly to the Visayas. Towns previously under Spanish control were taken over by local revolutionary forces. Aguinaldo's leadership restored coherence to the movement, and the revolutionaries gained strength through widespread local participation. The organization of the Revolutionary Army was improved, incorporating both experienced veterans from the first phase of the revolution and newly recruited volunteers. Weapons purchased earlier using funds from the Biak-na-Bato settlement were distributed, and captured Spanish arms supplemented the supply. Aguinaldo also moved quickly to establish political authority. On May 24, 1898, he issued a decree formally reinstating a revolutionary government, declaring himself as its head with the title of Dictator of the Philippines. This provisional government aimed to coordinate military and civil administration, maintain order in liberated areas, and represent Filipino interests in dealings with foreign powers. The government's administrative structure included departments for war, finance, justice, and internal affairs. Aguinaldo's headquarters in Cavite became the center of both military operations and civil governance. Military victories followed in rapid succession. Key Spanish garrisons in Imus, Bacoor, and Naic were captured, and the revolutionary flag was raised over reclaimed territories. One of the most notable engagements was the Battle of Alapan on May 28, 1898, near Imus, Cavite, where Aguinaldo's forces defeated a Spanish contingent. The event marked the first official use of the Philippine national flag, which had been designed in Hong Kong and sewn by Marcela Agoncillo. The flag was formally unfurled after the victory, symbolizing the unity of the revolutionary forces and the reassertion of national identity. Meanwhile, the Spanish authority collapsed rapidly outside Manila. Revolutionary control extended over most of central and southern Luzon, as well as parts of the Visayan Islands. Spanish officials retreated to fortified positions in Manila, awaiting reinforcements that never arrived. The U.S. naval blockade of Manila Bay prevented communication and supply from reaching the city, further weakening Spanish defenses. Aguinaldo's forces surrounded the capital, effectively besieging it by land, while the Americans controlled access by sea. In June 1898, Aguinaldo issued further decrees outlining the framework for an independent Philippine government. He called for the establishment of municipal governments in liberated areas, the collection of taxes, and the administration of justice under Filipino authority. These measures reflected his intent to demonstrate to both Filipinos and foreign powers that the revolution had evolved into an organized and legitimate movement capable of self-governance. As coordination between the revolutionary and American forces continued, Aguinaldo believed that U.S. support would lead to formal recognition of Philippine independence. American officers maintained friendly relations but avoided explicit commitments. Despite this ambiguity, Aguinaldo pressed forward with political initiatives designed to consolidate Filipino sovereignty. His return from exile had transformed the revolution from a regional rebellion into a nationwide struggle with a clear political and military direction. The reorganization of the revolutionary government and the rapid succession of victories between May and June 1898 positioned Aguinaldo as the central figure in the renewed independence movement. By mid-year, the Philippines had entered a decisive stage in its history. The Spanish colonial regime had lost control of most of the archipelago, and the revolution had regained momentum under a unified command. The next step for Aguinaldo was to formalize independence, a move that would occur on June 12, 1898, with the proclamation at Kawit, Cavite. By mid-1898, the Philippine Revolution had regained its full momentum under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo. After his return from exile in May, the revolutionary forces achieved consistent victories across the archipelago, effectively dismantling Spanish control outside the city of Manila. In most provinces, revolutionary governments were established, and the Spanish colonial administration was reduced to its final stronghold within the walled city of Intramuros. However, the evolving situation was no longer a simple conflict between Filipinos and Spaniards. The entry of the United States into the Philippines during the Spanish-American War had introduced a third power whose intentions would soon redefine the course of the revolution. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo proclaimed the independence of the Philippines from Spanish rule at Kawit, Cavite. The declaration, witnessed by Filipino revolutionaries, local officials, and residents, was accompanied by the official raising of the Philippine national flag and the performance of the newly composed national anthem by Julian Felipe. The proclamation declared that the Philippines was a free and independent nation under a revolutionary government, with Aguinaldo as its head. Although this act symbolized the culmination of years of struggle, it lacked recognition from foreign powers, including the United States, whose forces were now operating alongside, but not under, the authority of Aguinaldo's government. In the weeks following the proclamation, Aguinaldo consolidated his political and military structures. He formed the Revolutionary Congress, intended to serve as an advisory and legislative body, and continued to expand control over the provinces. By July, nearly all of Luzon and significant parts of the Visayas were under Filipino administration. Revolutionary forces surrounded Manila, effectively cutting off the Spanish garrison from external support. Inside the city, Governor-General Fermin Jardines commanded the remaining Spanish troops, numbering around 13,000, who were trapped, short of supplies, and suffering from disease and low morale. Communication with Madrid was disrupted, and the situation was unsustainable. It also stated that the Philippines placed itself under the protection of the United States, which was then engaged in war with Spain. This reference reflected the hope that the U.S. would support Philippine independence in recognition of the shared goal of defeating Spanish colonialism. The document was signed by 98 persons, representing various provinces and sectors of the revolutionary movement. After the ceremony, copies of the declaration were distributed to provincial revolutionary governments and foreign representatives. Aguinaldo sent formal communications to U.S. commanders, notifying them of the proclamation and requesting recognition. The message emphasized that the Filipino people had established an independent government and expected to be treated as allies rather than subjects. However, No official response recognizing Philippine independence was issued by the U.S. authorities. American officials avoided explicit commitments, focusing instead on their military objectives against Spain. In the following weeks, Aguinaldo continued to strengthen administrative control. He established local governments in newly liberated provinces, each supervised by revolutionary representatives. Civil authorities were appointed to manage taxation, law enforcement, and the collection of supplies for the army. The revolutionary government also began issuing decrees, forming ministries, and organizing a system of communication between provinces. These efforts aimed to transform the revolutionary organization into a functioning state capable of governing a unified nation. Despite these developments, international recognition remained elusive. No foreign power formally acknowledged the June 12 declaration. The United States maintained neutrality regarding the status of the Philippine government, while European nations refrained from comment. This diplomatic silence would later have significant implications for the future of Philippine sovereignty. By July 1898, Aguinaldo's forces had expanded control over nearly all of Luzon and parts of the Visayas. Manila remained the only major area under Spanish occupation. Revolutionary headquarters were established in Bacoor, and plans were made to move toward Malolos, Bulacan, to organize a central government. The Declaration of Independence thus served both as a symbolic act of national assertion and as a practical foundation for governance. It represented the culmination of centuries of resistance against colonial domination and the institutional beginning of a modern Philippine state. Although the revolutionary government exercised authority over most territories, its diplomatic position remained uncertain. The arrival of increasing numbers of American troops and their exclusion of Filipino forces from strategic discussions surrounding Manila suggested a growing division between the two movements. The June 12 declaration marked a high point in Filipino aspirations for self-rule, but also preceded the complex negotiations and political challenges that would soon emerge after the Spanish surrender on August 13, 1898. After the Spanish surrender of Manila on August 13, 1898, the Philippines entered a complex political phase defined by uncertainty over sovereignty and governance. Although the Philippine Revolutionary Government, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, exercised control over most of the archipelago, the United States assumed military authority over Manila and its suburbs. The exclusion of Filipino forces from the city's capture deepened mistrust between Aguinaldo's administration and American commanders. While both sides continued to present themselves as allies, their objectives diverged sharply. Aguinaldo sought full independence under a constitutional government, while the United States, following Spain's defeat, viewed the Philippines as a territory subject to future American administration. In the weeks following the surrender, Aguinaldo focused on consolidating governance outside Manila. On August 23, 1898, he issued a decree establishing the Malolos Congress, formerly known as the Revolutionary Congress of the Philippines, which convened in Malolos, Bulacan. The Congress was intended to draft a constitution, create laws, and provide a representative structure to replace the dictatorial system established earlier. This step marked the transition from a revolutionary to a constitutional government. Delegates were elected from provinces under Filipino control, representing various regions and professions. The Congress first met on September 15, 1898, in the Barasoan Church, which became the seat of the revolutionary legislature. The opening session of the Malolos Congress was a significant political event. It was attended by 85 delegates, though the number varied in later sessions. The assembly adopted rules for deliberation, elected a presiding officer, and confirmed the legitimacy of Aguinaldo's government. The Congress recognized Aguinaldo as president of the Philippine Revolutionary Government, thereby giving his leadership constitutional sanction. Among the prominent members were Pedro Paterno, Felipe Calderon, Apolinario Mabini, Gregorio Araneda, and José Clemenzuda, all of whom contributed to legislative and constitutional discussions. The Congress served not only as a legislative body, but also as a forum for debates on governance, sovereignty, and the structure of the emerging republic. Simultaneously, a commission on the Constitution was formed, with Felipe Calderon as its principal author. The draft Constitution drew inspiration from several political models, including the constitutions of Spain, 1812, France, Third Republic, and certain Latin American republics. The proposed charter established a republican government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. It vested executive authority in the president, legislative powers in a representative assembly, and judicial authority in an independent judiciary. It guaranteed civil liberties such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, reflecting liberal and nationalist ideals. The draft also declared Catholicism as the state religion, but with guarantees of tolerance, a decision that drew debate within the Congress. While the Congress deliberated, tensions with the United States continued to grow. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ended the Spanish-American War and transferred sovereignty over the Philippines from Spain to the United States for a payment of $20 million. The treaty was negotiated without Filipino representation, despite the revolutionaries' control over most of the territory. Aguinaldo and his cabinet were not informed or consulted about the agreement. When its contents became known, the revolutionary government issued a formal protest, arguing that sovereignty resided with the Filipino people and could not be transferred without their consent. Nevertheless, the United States proceeded with ratification. Despite these developments, the Malolos Congress continued its work. After months of deliberation, the Constitution of the First Philippine Republic was completed and ratified on January 20th, 1899. The following day, January 21st, 1899, Aguinaldo promulgated the Constitution and officially inaugurated the First Philippine Republic, also known as the Malolos Republic. The event took place at the Barasoan Church, where Aguinaldo took an oath of office as President of the Republic of the Philippines. The Malolos Constitution thus became the first democratic constitution in Asia, establishing a government based on the consent of the governed and the separation of powers. The structure of the new republic was outlined in detail. Aguinaldo retained the presidency, while a cabinet of ministers managed key departments including war, finance, interior, and foreign affairs. The Congress retained legislative authority and held the power to approve budgets, declare war, and ratify treaties. The judiciary was designed to function independently, though its scope was limited by wartime conditions. The Republic adopted Malolos as its capital, where government offices were organized and state functions carried out. Efforts were made to standardize administration, taxation, and the delivery of public services. Revolutionary newspapers were established to communicate decrees and promote civic education. Apolinario Mabini, often regarded as the brains of the revolution, served as Prime Minister and Secretary of Foreign Affairs. His political philosophy emphasized national unity, civic virtue, and adherence to law. Mabini's influence shaped much of the early republic's administrative and diplomatic strategy. However, disagreements emerged between Mabini and more conservative members of the Congress, including Pedro Paterno, who favored a conciliatory approach toward the United States. These internal divisions weakened the government's ability to present a unified response to external challenges. Throughout late 1898 and early 1899, Filipino and American forces maintained uneasy contact. Filipino troops surrounded Manila, occupying nearby towns such as Caloocan, San Juan del Monte, and Pasig, while American troops fortified positions within and around the capital. Both sides avoided open conflict, but negotiations failed to produce mutual understanding. Aguinaldo's government sought recognition of independence, while the United States prepared for administrative control based on the terms of the Treaty of Paris. American military leaders, including General Elwell Otis, refused to recognize the authority of the Philippine Republic. The American occupation government began to issue proclamations asserting U.S. sovereignty over the islands. On January 4, 1899, President William McKinley transmitted instructions through General Otis announcing that U.S. authority extended throughout the Philippines. This declaration directly contradicted Aguinaldo's position and inflamed tensions. The revolutionary government responded by reiterating its independence and instructing its troops to remain on alert but not to initiate hostilities. By January 1899, the situation had reached a critical stage. The Philippine Republic existed as a functioning government with administrative control over most of the country, but its legitimacy was challenged by a foreign power occupying the capital. Communication between the two forces broke down entirely. Both armies fortified their positions, anticipating possible confrontation. The aspirations embodied in the Malolos Constitution, national sovereignty, democratic governance, and independence, were now directly at odds with American policy in the archipelago. The First Philippine Republic stood as the culmination of years of revolutionary struggle. It embodied the Filipino pursuit of political autonomy and institutional governance. Yet its existence was precarious, shaped by both internal divisions and the external presence of a new colonial power. Within weeks of its establishment, escalating tensions between the Philippine and American forces would culminate in open conflict, marking the beginning of the Philippine-American War in February 1899. The fragile relationship between the First Philippine Republic and the United States collapsed in early 1899, leading to the outbreak of the Philippine-American War. Although both sides had cooperated against Spain in 1898, their goals were fundamentally different. The Philippine Republic, established under Emilio Aguinaldo, sought recognition as an independent nation, while the United States viewed the archipelago as a territory acquired through the Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898. This treaty, ratified without Filipino representation, transferred sovereignty over the Philippines from Spain to the United States for a payment of $20 million. The resulting conflict was both political and military, as the Filipinos resisted foreign domination and the Americans sought to establish colonial authority. Tensions escalated rapidly after the treaty's ratification. The U.S. military, under Major General Elwell Otis, occupied Manila and its immediate surroundings, while Filipino forces held positions on the outskirts, particularly around Caloocan, San Juan del Monte, and Pasig. Despite several attempts at negotiation, neither side agreed on jurisdictional boundaries. On January 4, 1899, President William McKinley proclaimed American sovereignty over the Philippines, directing Otis to extend U.S. authority throughout the islands. Aguinaldo responded by issuing a counter-proclamation on January 5th, declaring the independence of the Philippine Republic and warning against any act that would undermine national sovereignty. Both sides maintained military readiness as diplomatic channels failed. The war began on the night of February 4, 1899, when a skirmish broke out between American and Filipino soldiers near San Juan Bridge in Santa Mesa, Manila. A patrol from the U.S. 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry fired on Filipino troops who had approached their position. The incident quickly escalated into a full-scale engagement. By the next morning, American forces launched a general offensive against Filipino positions north of Manila. The Battle of Manila, February 4th to 5th, 1899, resulted in heavy Filipino casualties, with over 3,000 killed or wounded. Aguinaldo's government declared that hostilities had been initiated by American aggression, while General Otis reported that the Filipinos had attacked first. The conflict spread rapidly across Luzon. Filipino forces, under the overall command of General Antonio Luna, attempted to mount a coordinated defense. Luna, a disciplined military strategist, sought to establish a centralized army and enforce strict discipline among regional commanders. However, logistical challenges, poor communication, and regional autonomy limited his effectiveness. In February and March 1899, the Americans captured key towns, including Caloocan, Malabon, and Bulacan, forcing the Filipino army to retreat northward toward Malolos, the revolutionary capital. On March 31, 1899, American troops captured Malolos after a brief battle, prompting Aguinaldo to relocate his government to San Isidro, Nueva Ecija. Despite losing territory, Filipino resistance continued. Aguinaldo's forces relied on mobile warfare, avoiding large confrontations and using guerrilla tactics. Luna continued to lead conventional operations until his death on June 5, 1899, in Cabanatuan, Nueva Ecija, under circumstances that remain debated by historians. His death weakened the cohesion of the Revolutionary Army and deprived it of its most capable commander. Aguinaldo assumed direct command of military operations while maintaining a mobile government that shifted locations frequently to evade capture. The United States expanded its military presence in the archipelago, increasing troop strength from 20,000 to over 60,000 by late 1899. Command passed from General Otis to General Arthur MacArthur Jr., who implemented aggressive campaigns to occupy strategic provinces. By the end of 1899, American forces had secured most of central and southern Luzon, including Tarlac, Pampanga, and Pangasinan. Aguinaldo continued to evade capture by retreating north through Ilocos and eventually into the Cordillera Mountains. His capture became a primary objective for the U.S. military. As the formal fronts collapsed, the war entered its guerrilla phase in late 1899. Filipino resistance devolved into localized insurgencies led by regional commanders such as General Miguel Malvar in Batangas, Mariano Trias in Cavite, and Simeonola in Albay. The guerrilla fighters operated in small units, conducting ambushes, sabotage, and intelligence operations. The Americans responded with counterinsurgency measures that included the establishment of zones of protection, forced relocation of civilians, and the destruction of crops in villages suspected of aiding guerrillas. These tactics caused widespread hardship and loss of life among the civilian population. In November 1899, Aguinaldo's forces suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Tirad Pass in Ilocos Sur. A small detachment led by General Gregorio del Pilar attempted to delay pursuing American troops to allow Aguinaldo to escape further north. Del Pilar and most of his men were killed in the encounter. Aguinaldo continued his flight through Abra and eventually into Isabela, maintaining communication with the remaining resistance leaders. American troops intensified their pursuit, using local guides and intelligence networks to track his movements. On March 23, 1901, Aguinaldo was captured in Palanan, Isabela, by American forces led by General Frederick Funston. The operation involved infiltration and deception, with Funston's men posing as prisoners escorted by Filipino scouts loyal to the Americans. Aguinaldo was taken to Manila, where he swore an oath of allegiance to the United States on April 19, 1901. His capture effectively ended organized resistance under the authority of the First Philippine Republic, though isolated fighting continued for months in other regions. After Aguinaldo's capture, the U.S. military shifted its focus to suppressing remaining guerrilla activity. General Miguel Malvar continued to lead forces in Batangas until his surrender on April 16, 1902. Resistance in the Baikal region under Simeon Ola persisted until September 1903, though by then, large-scale warfare had ended. In Mindanao, where Muslim resistance had a distinct historical and cultural context, conflict continued intermittently for several years. The official end of the Philippine-American War was declared by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt on July 4, 1902, marking the formal cessation of hostilities. However, resistance and unrest persisted in certain areas long afterward. American casualties during the war were approximately 4,200 killed and 2,800 wounded, while Filipino military deaths exceeded 20,000, with civilian casualties estimated in the hundreds of thousands due to combat, famine, and disease. The establishment of U.S. colonial rule followed swiftly. The Philippine Commission, led by William Howard Taft, replaced military administration with a civil government beginning in 1901. American authorities implemented policies aimed at pacification, education, and infrastructure development, while suppressing nationalist movements. Aguinaldo, now retired from active politics, lived under surveillance but later participated in civic activities. Other revolutionary leaders were either integrated into the new administration or marginalized. The Philippine-American War marked the conclusion of the revolutionary era that began in 1896. It transformed the Philippines from a Spanish colony to an American dependency, redefining its political trajectory in the early 20th century. The conflict also demonstrated the persistence of Filipino aspirations for self-rule and laid the groundwork for later independence movements that would continue into the next generation. The Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1898 stands as the first large-scale and sustained anti-colonial uprising in Asia led by a colonized people against a Western empire. Its legacy is rooted in its political, social, and cultural transformations that redefined Filipino identity, governance, and nationalism. Although the revolution did not achieve lasting independence due to subsequent American colonization, it permanently altered the political consciousness of the Filipino population and laid the foundation for modern Philippine nationhood. The revolution's immediate legacy was the establishment of the first Philippine Republic in Malolos, Bulacan, in 1899, which represented the first constitutional government in Asia founded by an anti-colonial movement. The Malolos Constitution, ratified on January 21, 1899, articulated the principles of popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and individual rights. Its framers drew upon Enlightenment ideals and liberal democratic models, reflecting both European intellectual influence and indigenous political aspirations. Although short-lived, the Republic provided an administrative and ideological framework that would influence subsequent political developments, including later constitutions under both American and independent Philippine governments. The revolution also redefined national identity. Before 1896, the term Filipino primarily referred to Spaniards born in the Philippines or to members of the local elite educated under Spanish institutions. The revolution expanded the meaning to include all inhabitants of the archipelago, regardless of ethnicity or class. The writings of José Rizal, the propaganda movement's reformist ideals, and the revolutionary activities of the Katipunan unified diverse linguistic and regional groups under a single national consciousness. This concept of Filipino nationhood became the central legacy of the revolution, an enduring idea that transcended the conflict's military outcome. Socially, the revolution disrupted the colonial hierarchy that had been in place since the 16th century. Spanish friars and religious orders, who had dominated land ownership and education, saw their power challenged and gradually diminished. The revolutionary government confiscated friar estates and promoted secular education, although these policies were only partially implemented due to the war. Peasant uprisings, particularly in Cavite, Laguna, and Batangas, exposed deep socioeconomic inequalities that persisted beyond Spanish rule. The demands for land reform and social justice expressed during the revolution would continue to shape Philippine political movements in the 20th century. The role of the Katipunan, founded by Andrés Bonifacio in 1892, became central in shaping the revolution's structure and ideology. The organization's secret cell system, revolutionary catechism, and emphasis on unity and sacrifice reflected a shift from intellectual reformism to direct action. Bonifacio's vision of a mass-based revolution represented the participation of the working class and lower sectors of society in political change. Although Bonifacio's execution in 1897 symbolized internal divisions within the revolutionary ranks, his role as the initiator of armed struggle ensured his enduring place in national memory as the father of the Philippine Revolution. Internationally, the Philippine Revolution had wider implications. It demonstrated that colonial subjects in Asia could organize, mobilize, and wage war against a European empire. It inspired subsequent nationalist movements in Indonesia, Vietnam, and other parts of Southeast Asia. The revolution also intersected with global events, notably the Spanish-American War of 1898, which transformed the Philippines into a focal point of U.S. expansion in the Pacific. While the revolution's immediate political goal was overtaken by foreign intervention, Its example contributed to the global discourse on self-determination that would gain prominence in the early 20th century. The intellectual foundations of the revolution were laid by the propaganda movement of the 1880s, whose members, including José Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Graciano López Gina, advocated for equality under Spanish law and representation in the Cortes. Their reformist writings, disseminated through publications such as La Solidaridad, influenced the generation that launched the revolution. Rizal's novels, Nali Mi Tanher and El Filibusterismo, exposed the abuses of the colonial government and the clergy, creating an intellectual environment ripe for rebellion. His execution on December 30th, 1896, transformed him into a unifying martyr for the revolutionary cause. Economically, the revolution disrupted traditional trade and agriculture, but also highlighted the role of the native population in shaping economic policy. Revolutionary leaders attempted to reorganize taxation and labor systems to sustain their military campaigns. The concept of economic independence, control over resources and production, emerged as a secondary goal alongside political autonomy. These efforts laid the groundwork for later economic nationalism under American and post-war administrations. Culturally, the revolution fostered a sense of collective memory expressed in literature, songs, and symbols. The Katipunan flag, the Sun and Stars emblem, and the national anthem Lupang Hinirang became lasting representations of national unity. The revolution also produced a corpus of political writings, decrees, and correspondence that shaped the early Filipino political lexicon. Figures such as Apolinario Mabini, the brains of the revolution, contributed to the intellectual consolidation of Republican ideals, arguing for the moral and legal foundations of sovereignty. His True Decalogue and other writings continue to be referenced as early expressions of Filipino political philosophy. The revolution's internal conflicts, particularly between factions led by Bonifacio and Aguinaldo, revealed structural challenges in uniting diverse revolutionary movements. Regionalism, differing social backgrounds, and conflicting visions of governance hindered unified command. These divisions were exploited by both Spanish and later American authorities. Nevertheless, the ability of the revolution to sustain itself across multiple provinces demonstrated a significant degree of organization and commitment among its participants. The administrative structure established in the liberated areas, including local governments, taxation systems, and military organization, reflected an early exercise in self-governance. From a military perspective, the revolution introduced new tactics and organizational forms suited to local conditions. Lacking formal training and advanced weaponry, revolutionary forces relied on mobility, local terrain knowledge, and popular support. The use of guerrilla tactics would later reappear in subsequent resistance movements, including the Filipino struggle against American forces and the Japanese occupation during World War II. This continuity of irregular warfare became a defining feature of Philippine military history. The educational legacy of the revolution emerged from its emphasis on enlightenment and civic instruction. The revolutionary government established schools in liberated zones, recognizing education as a foundation for national unity and civic responsibility. These initiatives, though interrupted by war, represented the transition from clerical to secular instruction. The later American educational system, while different in content and orientation, built upon this foundation of mass education as a means of governance and modernization. The revolution's documents, including the Acta de la Proclamación de la Independencia del Pueblo Filipino of June 12, 1898, remain primary sources for understanding the evolution of Filipino political thought. The Declaration's language invoked both historical grievance and modern principles of sovereignty. It articulated the Filipino people's right to self-determination, drawing legitimacy from both divine law and the consent of the governed. Although later overshadowed by the Treaty of Paris, the act marked the first formal assertion of Philippine nationhood recognized by its own leaders. The memory of the Philippine Revolution was institutionalized in the following decades through commemorations, monuments, and education. National heroes such as Rizal, Bonifacio, Mabini, and Aguinaldo were memorialized, and their lives incorporated into the national curriculum. Historical societies and government institutions in the early American period sought to preserve revolutionary documents and interpret the events within a broader narrative of progress toward eventual self-rule. The revolution thus became the foundational episode in the Philippines' national historiography, shaping both civic identity and political discourse. The revolution's ultimate historical significance lies in its transformation of colonial subjects into citizens aware of their collective rights and national destiny. It established the precedent for constitutional governance and civic participation in the Philippines. Although foreign domination continued after 1898, the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and national sovereignty persisted as guiding principles in the country's subsequent struggles for independence and reform. Following the Spanish surrender in Manila on August 13, 1898, the Philippines entered a period of political uncertainty marked by the emergence of a new colonial power, the United States. The revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had already declared independence 2 months earlier, on June 12, 1898, and established a revolutionary government. However, the defeat of Spain in the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in December 1898 altered the course of the revolution and the country's future. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formally ended hostilities between Spain and the United States. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States in exchange for $20 million. The Filipino revolutionary government was not consulted or represented in the negotiations. The treaty effectively transferred sovereignty over the archipelago from one colonial power to another, disregarding the Philippine Declaration of Independence and the existence of a functioning revolutionary administration. Between August 1898 and February 1899, relations between Filipino forces and American troops stationed in Manila were tense, but not yet openly hostile. Aguinaldo's government had established its capital in Malolos, where the Malolos Congress convened on September 15, 1898, to draft a constitution. The Malolos Constitution, promulgated on January 21, 1899, defined the Philippines as an independent republic with a representative government. The United States, however, refused to recognize the republic, asserting its authority over the islands as a result of the Treaty of Paris. During this period, both sides maintained uneasy coexistence. The Americans controlled Manila and its suburbs, while the revolutionary government held most of the surrounding provinces. Tensions grew as U.S. military patrols expanded their movements beyond the city, encroaching on areas under Filipino control. Diplomatic communications between Aguinaldo and General Lwel S. Otis, the American military governor, failed to resolve disputes over jurisdiction. The United States government, led by President William McKinley, had already decided on a policy of benevolent assimilation, announced on December 21, 1898, which stated the U.S. intention to establish civil order and extend sovereignty over the Philippines. This proclamation, when translated and circulated, deepened Filipino distrust, as it implied the replacement of Spanish rule with American control. Hostilities formally began on the night of February 4, 1899, when a skirmish broke out between American and Filipino forces near San Juan Bridge, between the districts of Santa Mesa and San Juan del Monte. The initial exchange occurred when an American sentry from the Nebraska Volunteer Infantry, Private William W. Grayson, fired upon approaching Filipino soldiers who failed to halt when challenged. The incident escalated rapidly into a full-scale battle. By morning, American forces had launched coordinated attacks against Filipino positions north and south of Manila, initiating the Philippine-American War. The conflict that followed lasted until 1902, characterized by conventional warfare in its early phase and guerrilla resistance in its later years. In the initial months, the Philippine Revolutionary Army, under General Antonio Luna, attempted to conduct organized defense using European-style military formations. Luna, a disciplined tactician, sought to centralize command and impose stricter discipline within the army. Despite his efforts, the revolutionaries were poorly equipped and outmatched by the superior weaponry and logistics of the U.S. Army. Major engagements included the Battle of Caloocan, February 10, 1899, the Battle of Malolos, March 31, 1899, and the Battle of Quingua, April 23, 1899. Each resulted in strategic setbacks for the Filipino forces. In June 1899, Luna was assassinated in Cabanatuan under circumstances that remain debated by historians. His death removed one of the most capable military leaders of the revolution and further fragmented resistance. Aguinaldo retreated northward through Pampanga, Tarlac, and eventually into Nueva Ecija and Pangasinan, reorganizing guerrilla operations as conventional resistance became unsustainable. By late 1899, the American forces, commanded by General Arthur MacArthur Jr. and General Henry W. Lawton, implemented a systematic campaign to capture Aguinaldo and dismantle the remaining revolutionary forces. By 1900, the war had transformed into a widespread guerrilla struggle. Filipino fighters, organized in small mobile units, conducted ambushes, raids, and sabotage operations against American patrols and supply lines. The U.S. military responded with a combination of counterinsurgency measures, including zones of protection, reconcentration policies, and civic programs intended to pacify local populations. These operations were often accompanied by harsh reprisals, including property destruction and civilian detentions. Casualty estimates vary, but historical records indicate that between 200,000 and 300,000 Filipino civilians died from combat, disease, and famine during the conflict. The capture of Emilio Aguinaldo on March 23, 1901, in Palanan, Isabela, by forces led by General Frederick Funston and Filipino scouts, marked a turning point. Aguinaldo was brought to Manila, where he swore allegiance to the United States on April 19, 1901. Although pockets of resistance continued under local commanders such as General Miguel Malvar in Batangas, General Simeonola in Albay, and Macario Siki in Rizal, organized revolutionary resistance had effectively collapsed by 1902. The U.S. Congress passed the Philippine Organic Act in 1902, establishing a civil government under American sovereignty. The act created the Philippine Commission, headed by William Howard Taft, which served as the legislative body and provided for limited Filipino participation in local administration. The act also officially declared the end of the insurrection on July 4, 1902, and granted amnesty to Filipinos who had participated in the war. Under the new colonial administration, the U.S. introduced political, educational, and economic reforms. The public school system was reorganized, with English designated as the medium of instruction. The Philippine Constabulary was established in 1901 to maintain internal order. Land reforms and public health initiatives were introduced, though many of these benefited urban elites and American investors more than the rural population. Despite claims of modernization, the transition reinforced patterns of dependence that had existed under Spanish rule. The transition from Spanish to American control also transformed the structure of Filipino society and governance. The American colonial government emphasized gradual political participation through local elections, but ultimate authority remained with the U.S. administration. Many members of the pre-revolutionary elite, landowners, lawyers, and educated illustrados, collaborated with the new regime, seeing in it an opportunity for political advancement. This created a division between former revolutionaries who accepted American rule and those who continued underground resistance movements in rural areas. In the broader historical context, the years between 1898 and 1902 marked the Philippines' shift from Spanish colonialism to American imperialism. The revolutionary movement that had begun as a struggle for independence against Spain evolved into a prolonged resistance against a new colonial power. Although the U.S. justified its rule through modernization programs, the transition represented a continuation of foreign control, delaying the realization of full sovereignty for nearly half a century.